when we went to the Ryle lecture, when Rafe introduced himself, I was first surprised by the fact that he was in his 32nd year of public school teaching and that he teaches at a school called Hobart Elementary, where 92% of the population is below the poverty level and no one speaks English as their first language.
Yeah, that's kind of like shocked me too. And the other thing that shocked me was how he runs his classroom by using the 6 levels of moral development, which I don't ever remember hearing that in any of my education classes. I only remember hearing that like in one of my psychology classes. So I didn't really know how he was going to be able to like use it in his classroom until he like started talking about it. But the other part of that that shocked me was the second level on how he doesn't give rewards. Almost every teacher I have been with or I've had placements with, they've given rewards. And what he said about it is they shouldn't just be completing assignments just to get like a reward at the end. And he doesn't do rewards because he says it's ridiculous and superficial. You don't need to bribe children in order for them to do something. And having rewards, it's just gonna like make them only do things because they think they're gonna get something out of it, and they should be doing it because they want to learn about things and they want to like engage in their own education. So,
All right, well, I have a question for you. How does his teaching practices influence your teaching philosophy?
well, I think that the main thing that it coincides with my teaching philosophy is how he teaches things that he wants his students to use 10 years from now, which is what I believe in. I think that we should be learning things that have purpose and meaning. And if children are learning about things that they can relate to their own lives and they can find the meaning in it, chances are it's going to stick with them more. So, like, for example, now that we're like actually in the program, I enjoy like doing some of the assignments for school because I know that it's like all based towards my career. Whereas like when I was in high school or when I was just like getting my AAT, I was just doing like the beginning like classes, which pretty much had like nothing to do with what I wanted to do as my career. So the more that like I think the education is meaningful, then I think the more kids are going to like enjoy learning and enjoy going to school. What was the most important thing that you walked away from the lecture with?
Well, Rafe really stressed that you need to be a good role model for your students and that you be the person you want your students to be. So I think this is like one of the biggest things that I learned from this lecture because you can't expect your students to behave well and listen if you aren't willing to do the same. And your students aren't going to learn this concept through a lecture. It has to be by example. And he said the real assessment is where the children will be in 10 years or 20 years. So if you're teaching them how to act and how to treat other people and how to do things because they want to improve like themselves as a person and not just do it for a reward, then they're going to be better people overall. And as teachers, we need to think about what is going to make them successful people in life and not just at the end of the year test. um, Rafe had a classroom full of ELL learners, and the article I read, Podcasting Playbook, talked about the study that integrated podcasts into the classroom to help benefit ELL learners. And my article talked about 4 different target goals for the podcasts, which are language development, content knowledge, communication, and performance. And then along with the 4 different target goals, the podcast lessons have 4 primary components. The first one is a media or audio file. The second is downloading, so downloading that file or uploading it somewhere. The devices used to record the podcast, and then the different episodes that you could use for recording podcasts and using them in a lesson, and that's called syndication. Um, the practice of using podcasts in teaching is called pedagogy. The article made this word up, but they said pedagogy is the best practice for podcast language learning, and it allows ELL students to record themselves and their classmates and to listen to how they talk, and that'll help with their language and speech improvement. And pedagogy is a good technology tool to use in the classroom because it's mobile, flexible, and economical.
Oh, okay. So, what problems did they experience when they were trying to use the podcast in the classroom?
Well, the article discussed several barriers that made podcasting in the classroom difficult for the students and the teachers, and these barriers included the teachers' pedagogical beliefs, the technology skills of students and teachers, because some teachers needed training on and students needed training on how to use like the different equipment and like how to upload the files and everything. Time for planning like when to use a podcast in a lesson or how students will benefit from that. Professional development. A lot of teachers had problems with outdated equipment and outdated software. And then another big problem was limited funding. And although there are some barriers the teachers face when trying to use podcasts in their lesson, the research from the study showed that a positive effect on students when compared to traditional learning. So using podcasts in their lesson was making a big difference in the students' learning.
Oh, okay. I mean, that kind of like goes with what my article was about. Mine was Talk the Talk, learner-generated podcast as catalyst for knowledge creation. And what the article was pretty much just a study that was done to see what the results would be if students created their own podcast for their peers to listen to, which would be based on the subject matter that was being taught in the classroom. The podcast would be about like 3 to 5 minutes in length, and then would just be on the certain subject matter that students were learning in class. So an example would be if like students were learning how to type a research project or learning the things that go into that, the podcast could be about like how to look for credible articles, how to cite those articles properly, and yeah.
How would having access to podcasts on certain lessons be beneficial to students?
Well, by having the podcast available, they could listen to the informal discussion before going to class, and then they would have a little bit of background knowledge before they go into the classroom, which hopefully would help them participate more. So, I mean, because I know just me being in school, like if I know that something I'm learning is going to be on a test, I'm just frantically like writing down everything I can because I think that I'm going to like forget what to write down or I'm going to forget something that the teacher says. But if the students already have some sort of background knowledge before going into the class, then chances are they're going to be able to participate more because they already know what's going to be going on. And the other thing that the article talked about was it wasn't only the listeners who were learning, it was the speakers who also were learning things by creating the podcast. So in order to create the podcast, they had to have like collaboration, which you need teamwork to do that. So you have to figure out what you want to talk about on your podcast, and then so you have to make kind of like a script for it, which we would have done for this assignment if we did the podcast. But so you pretty much you make a script, and then you have to revise it, and then you actually make the podcast, and then you have to go back and revise that to make sure you have everything down that you wanted to say. Make sure the sound quality is good. You want to make sure that you have like fluency in it. And then after that, you need to figure out how you're going to publish your podcast. So you could do that through the web or some other way you can do that. So it wasn't only the listeners who were learning, but it was also like the people that were making the actual podcast. It was like a learning tool for them as well. And I just think that honestly, using podcasts is a great way to just like be engaged like in your learning. Like students can go home and they can listen to a podcast from their teacher, or they can before class like they did, they can learn about different terminology that's going to be in the class, which in a way I know would help me more because like when you hear like your friend talking about something and then your teacher talking about something, you might be able to understand it if your friend explains it to you rather than just like the teacher explaining it to you. So I just think they're a great way to help with learning, and I know that it would help me out a lot if we had that at Salisbury, just like a different, like a feed you could follow, and you could like watch certain like podcasts that go with like what you're learning in your classes. But that's pretty much all my article was about. Do you have like any other questions?
No, I just wanted to add something. Like my article said that it's a mobile tool too, and like you stressed that a lot with your article because students can like upload this to their like a file to their computer or email it to themselves, or teachers could email like what they worked on in class to them, and then they could use it at home like to help with their homework or like study too. And you said
Yeah.
like when you're trying to take notes, it would help you with a test, and I think that would help students a lot too. So,
Yeah, that's a
do
really
you
good
have
idea.
any questions for me?
I think I'm good.
All right.